Councils across the country have incurred greater costs during the pandemic, with that spending on PPE, greater need throughout the crisis in terms of staffing costs as well. At the beginning of the pandemic, Robert Jenrick promised no one would be out of pocket, but councils across the country, and including Luton, are. Can you give us an idea as to the scale of the gap in funding now, please?
Sure. So we've recently had, so overall, the MHCLG surveys, which the LGA has access to, suggest that the total kind of losses and increased costs arising this year are at about 11 billion. Part of that is tax losses, and they don't materialise till next year. So I'll just address the rest first. So the IFS have recently done some work for us looking at the pressures that we are faced compared to the funding that's been given. The pressures excluding tax are £7.2 billion this year, and there's a gap after all the government funding's taken into account, including the new income compensation scheme of £2 billion this year so far, and that's without taking into account what James was saying about, you know, councils are starting to draw back on their social care additional payments because they are worried that they haven't got the resources to pay for them. So there may be further pressures. And then on top of that, there's a shortfall of 3.7 billion estimated this year in council tax and business rates. As I say, that falls next year. We've had some work done by Local Government Futures, and they estimate that around £2 billion of that will be irrecoverable as well. And we don't yet know what the government's co-payment. It's talked about sharing that pressure. It said councils can spread it over 3 years, but it's nevertheless a pressure. So a council like Luton is going to have to think not just this year, how do I bridge the gap? And I know you've already had an emergency budget in your council, but they're also going to have to think about, well, what about next year and what about going forward? And some of the, that's without taking into account the fact that things like some of the council tax support increased demand is unlikely to just fade away. So it's not just this year's issue we're tackling, it's until we taper back to a more normal levels of income collection and council tax support, then there'll be further pressures on council budgets.
And when you're talking about that gap in funding, you're talking about just being able to keep the existing levels of services afloat, or are you talking about even more bare bones services?
That's just the COVID gap, and that's just keeping where we are with the COVID gap. There is a funding gap going forward for council services generally. The IFS are doing some more work for us on that, which we will be putting into the spending review. Our previous estimates, pre-COVID and in the last sort of spending round, were a funding gap of 6.4 billion for social care alone by 24-25. It's about 800-900 million a year, and that is without meeting any unmet need, without any investment in prevention, and without paying the workforce anymore. And if,
Sorry, and as you said, this year and in the future years, I know the answer to this, but I think it would be really important for the rest of the committee to hear it as well. Do you think that local authorities can take another round of cuts to their budgets from central government?
No. And that's a very short answer to that. No. And if you think about councils now with their emergency budgets and planning into next year and looking at savings plans, where are they going to get them from? Any council that's looking to significant savings from adult social care, for example, which is a big, as we heard, 37% of council spend is on adult social care. You know, where are they going to get those savings from in adult social care? Already it's the case that many councils have not been able to deliver this year's planned savings because of the crisis. So planning further savings, you know, they're already behind in their savings plans. Going into next year is going to be extremely difficult. I think, you know, we've seen that funding, we talked about the reduction, £15 billion of government funding over the decade. It's hard to see where else we would go and still be able to deliver even our core responsibilities. And I think James has said that for direct.